Welcome, everyone, to our next session. I am Kevin Barron. I'm the executive editor of Defense One, a national security news site out of Washington, covering the Pentagon and military and all things national security from industry to policy. And I'm thrilled to be hosting our session today. This one is called Terrorism Threats and Responses Online, the Role of ICTs. And we have two very interesting guests. I think we're going to have a good conversation. First, I have Dina Hussein, Counterterrorism and Dangerous Organizations Policy Head, which is a great title for Europe, Middle East, and Africa from Facebook, joining us from London, I believe. And Irene Poetranto, Senior Research Officer at the Citizen Lab, which is at the University of Toronto in Canada. So this is quite the international panel. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us.
So we have a lot to talk about, and this is there have been several sessions already on the docket about countering violent extremism and online terrorism. So maybe let's start basic and get into detail as we go along. I know you both have bring interesting perspectives. One literally from Facebook, from inside one of the biggest companies in the world for online issues related to all this area, and Citizen Lab. So why don't we start by just explaining a little bit about your organizations and your offices, your jobs, your roles of what you do, and how you view the current online extremist threats, whether it's from terrorism to extremism or maybe something else, where we are now after so many years, and where things are going, and also how you view the current landscape of solutions that are on the table and challenges in front of us. So Irene, do you want to start us off with that?
Sure. Thank you, Kevin. So as you mentioned earlier, I work for the Citizen Lab. We're a cybersecurity and human rights research lab based at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto in Toronto, Canada. And so we work on different issue areas in cybersecurity and human rights. Of particular concern with regard to this topic on counterterrorism would be our research areas on internet filtering or internet blocking of different websites and applications, as well as for example, the use of commercial spyware by governments and law enforcement around the world in the name of countering terrorism and organized crime. We are also concerned with different app security, the transparency of how our data is used, particularly because increasingly governments and law enforcement are requiring access to user data, again, to counter terrorism. And I think in terms of the challenges that we're seeing in this space is, first of all, there are definitional differences in terms of what counts as terrorism or acts of terrorism, even among, let's say, the OECD countries, which are, of course, liberal democracies, versus, elsewhere in the world, right? And so when companies have to operate globally, such as Facebook and others, and as well as internet service providers who are operating in different countries around the world, they then have to work with these different jurisdictions, different understandings of terrorism and acts of terrorism, which can create fragmentation in terms of how companies deal with this issue. Another concern is the fact that states are increasingly downloading their responsibilities to companies around the world to self-regulate. So this can lead to actions being taken that is outside of the rule of law, and or that are based on vague or unclear laws or terms of service that the companies have, right? And therefore, the concern is that companies are increasingly serving as the gatekeeper of freedom of expression, the arbiter or decision maker over what types of content are allowed and the limits of freedom of expression. And finally, I just mentioned that, banning illegal content or allegedly illegal content can raise multiple concerns. For example, there can be a lack of clarity, as I've already mentioned, in terms of the content being removed. Is it because it's illegal, or is it because of a breach of terms of service? It can also interfere with government investigations or disincentivize them, or get in the way of prosecutions of criminal activities. And then more generally, it can lead to either the over-blocking or over-removal of content, or the under-removal or under-blocking of content. And in the In terms of like carrying out these actions, search engines and social media platforms have communicated their efforts in terms of responding to counterterrorism or disinformation or conspiracy theories online. And the ways in which they've done it has predominantly include content takedowns or the suspension of accounts. And the fear is that, for us as researchers, is the overemphasis on content takedowns, because oftentimes they may occur with limited judicial oversight and an over-reliance on the use of artificial intelligence or algorithms, which can lead to false positives, human errors, even if humans are reviewing them, or censorship, as I've mentioned. For example, there was the case of YouTube removing videos that were uploaded by Syrian activists to document war crimes. So that would be an example of an over action or over removal of content due to relying on algorithms. And not to mention, the issue that these users can create different accounts, which, then creates like this game of whack-a-mole, right? Like this cat and mouse game between users and platforms. And at worst, it can lead to the victimization or perceived victimization of minorities, like minority ethnic groups or religious groups whose content are impacted by these policies. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Oh my gosh, stop there. That was, a Wild West list of things going on. I mean, it really feels like that. There's so much happening on this one question of how do you police online content? Should we police online content? What and who gets to do it and why and how? Luckily, Dina gets to answer all those questions on behalf of the entire internet. Okay, maybe not. Maybe from just your office. Dina, give us the same kind of introduction to what you do from your perch and what you're most interested in looking at as well, and we'll start a conversation after that.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Kevin. Thank you so much. And I will be asking for a raise now that I am speaking on behalf of the entire internet. That was
it's all Bitcoin.
Way above my pay grade, I think, Kevin, but hey, I'll take it. So first off, I want to thank the Souflan Center for the invitation. I want to thank you, Kevin, for hosting us. And I'm so excited to be on another panel with Irene because it's always an interesting conversation. I think it's really interesting to be having this conversation at this time, mainly because from my perch, as Kevin mentioned in Facebook, we're seeing the entire gamut of interplay between safety, security, demands for voice, demands for privacy. We're also at the very center of this dialogue around the interplay of where do service providers, internet, and social media companies stand within this wider dialogue of keeping the community safe, but understanding that there is the online world and the offline world and how those two interplay. The first thing I wanted to mention is my team at Facebook is a team that we refer to as the Dangerous Orgs and Individuals team. That's a very fancy way of describing a team that really creates the policies around 8 main buckets of abuse types. That's terrorist organizations, hateful organizations, criminal organizations, mass murderers and serial killers, violence-inducing conspiracy networks, and militarized social movements. It's a whole bunch of very, very complex issues that we're facing at any one point in time. And it's a real representation of the evolution that we've seen on the platform and in partnership with other tech and social media companies in the kind of threat and how it's evolving. So I'm going to start with the description of the kind of threat that we're seeing, how it's evolving, and then loop back around to the points that Irene was making about that wider landscape of how our approach to these abusive actors is situated within that conversation around voice and privacy and security. So to begin with, one of the things that I've found really interesting, having worked at Facebook now for almost 4 years, is that when we started out, we really were, as a team, looking at the main threats coming in from the big three, your Al-Qaeda, your ISIS, your Taliban. And that selfish jihadist movement presentation on Facebook was very clear and easier to adjudicate, right? You had a clear structure of command and control. You had clear propaganda dissemination nodes, and you were able to, in a pretty straightforward way, identify their newsletters, their propaganda videos because of their logos and the fact that they are actually very good at branding. As we've evolved and as our team has watched the threat evolve, we've seen that we've moved from these clear command and control centers to more amorphous network groups. So we're moving away from this organizational framework to a network and community-based abuse type, really. And it's interesting because that has major impacts on the way that we moderate. Now, you'll hear me say this a lot, but we've got a lot of people working on trust and safety at Facebook. We've got 35,000 people that work generally on that trust and safety bucket. But my team is 350 people strong, looking at countering terrorism and countering hateful organizations. So we're not lacking for human resources in that area. I think there's always space to grow and to do more. But I think it's an interesting thing to see that as we've grown this team, we've grown it because you need human expertise in more areas, in a myriad of areas. And one of the things—
Just more detail on that team.
Yeah.
Like what kinds of job titles are work on the 350 person team under you?
Absolutely. So we have everybody from people like myself who are former academics, for me, I was studying radicalization processes and looking specifically at the utilization of social media to either radicalize or move forward radical thought. But we've also got partners that are former law enforcement, former civil society, insert 3-letter intelligence agency here type of backgrounds. So we've got a myriad of people. We also have a lot of data scientists. We employ a lot of investigators who understand the forensics and the ins and outs of how people use social media. So we've got a pretty diverse set of folks.
Very good.
So as far as that team goes, we've really we started in 2016 looking at Salafist jihadist movements. We've now noticed that we're moving into an area where these organizations are now moving to networks that are amorphous. And the next frontier for us is understanding how conspiracy networks and extremists and violent extremists really meld, and how conspiracy networks can implicitly or explicitly lead to people taking action and taking violent action in that manner. And so that's an interesting trend that we're unpacking at any point in time. Another trend that we're unpacking at any point in time is the actual content that we're seeing online. So as I mentioned, when I started in this role and when the team was created, we were looking at propaganda, logoed propaganda, clear instruction manuals, newsletters. That's not the world that we live in anymore. Where we are now seeing things move is towards memes, towards the role of alternative kinds of media that are really visually engaging and that create a really broad entry point for whether it be extremists that are far-right extremists or other types of extremist milieus. But this new form of mimetic dialogue really brings down that barrier to entry, because you're engaging with a meme and you think it's funny, and then it opens a whole new world to you. So those are sort of the threats that I am at any one point in time tracking. And as Irene mentioned, all of the work that we do really is situated within the context of laws and responsibilities that we hold in whichever region that we are working in. And we are a very global company, as you all very well know, which means that, as Irene mentioned, at any point in time, I'm facing multiple different asks from multiple different jurisdictions. And I'm also facing this very interesting dynamic of different protections afforded to different users in different places in the world. And we are trying to level all of that up to say, actually, we're going to provide GDPR compliance for everybody, not just people in Europe. And that is a really good place to start off with. But as legislation becomes more complex and more nuanced and very regional, it would be interesting to have a discussion around how do we unify that? How do we make sure that we're providing these protections to all of our users? And how do we make sure that we can continue to do the job that we do? So that's a lot of information to give you, but I'm sure you'll have some follow-up questions.
That's great, and thanks. But so explain also, we can shift to then the question of solutions to these problems. How much does your team, and forgive me, Irene, for one follow-up to Dina, how much does your team, are you involved in creating solutions or recommend? Do you pass them up to change to another Facebook office, or are you just doing the tracking and letting them know here's the problem right now?
Yeah, again, all this conversation reminds me that I need to ask for a pay raise. No, we do basically everything. We are a centralized node of basically an ability to understand the threat, an ability to communicate with our content moderators and our intelligence teams in order to make sure that they are tracking all of the different kinds of threats that we're seeing. And then we are responding with the moderations teams to say, okay, if you see this kind of trend, respond in this way, or remove this way, or look for this indicator. And then we're also leveling up and highlighting to our leadership what the landscapes look like, what the landscape looks like, what the threat looks like. On a day-to-day basis, I send out multiple different emails to my manager and to others to say, from the EMEA perspective, here's what we're seeing. I've got counterparts in Asia Pacific that are doing the same. And we are tying in with the wider Facebook infrastructure as well. So we don't just work on the threat landscape. We also talk to our civil rights team to talk about how is the work that we're doing impacting civil rights. We talk to our teams that are looking at, for example, exploitation or trafficking, because that doesn't fall within my remit. But we want to make sure that where there is overlap, we're also communicating there.
So I wanted to ask you that because, Irene, I want from your perspective, is this all music to your ears, or is this all alarming? Because the general public, I think, has such a shallow understanding or even care about all the issues that you're talking about. In their heads, it's companies like Facebook are, social media companies one day are great, and the next day they're horrible, because depending on the news of the day and what the issue is and how it's being framed, whether they're policing themselves or not policing themselves, whether they should or shouldn't, or there's a specific incident that's happened, like congressional hearings or elections, whatever it may be. So when you hear Dina explain all those details that they're doing, like I said, is that music to your ears, or are there concerns that start to red flag in the back of your head?
Well, as an academic, I think we take a more nuanced approach. I mean, we certainly, as researchers working in this field, I think we really appreciate Facebook's efforts in being transparent and taking down organizations. I mean, if we look at, for example, the situation in Myanmar, Facebook has removed a lot of the military pages, right, labeling them as a dangerous organization as well, I believe. But I think we can all agree that more needs to be done because the problem is ever evolving, and because the problem is really complex, and because Facebook is a global company, right? And so I think, for example, when it comes to dangerous organizations, releasing the tiers are certainly helpful, but I think a lot of researchers have been demanding, for example, for the list itself to be made public, right? Who are the organizations that have been, or individuals that have been labeled as dangerous, and for what reason are they labeled as dangerous? And then more nuances, I think, in terms of, for example, when Facebook removes content because it is deemed to be in praise of or in support of dangerous organizations. The word praise or support can be really broad, right? And there have been instances of posts that are not in praise of or not in support of, just being critical of the subject matter, but that post was flagged and therefore taken down as well, which I think really goes to show to the complexity of the issues, the complexity of relying on algorithms, and then flagging them for human reviews, realizing that of course humans can make mistakes, and also realizing that the fact that Facebook operates globally, the company as a company, I think I can appreciate the challenges in terms of ensuring that non-English languages are receiving support, right? And this is why I think we see in Myanmar, there had been criticism that Facebook did not have enough content moderators who were able to speak the language, and as a result, hate speech proliferated on the platform, right? So I think it's important to, as Dina has already pointed out, to continue to do research in the space, to continue to allocate the needed resources in the space, to commit to transparency and meaningful transparency, which entails releasing granular data like the list that I mentioned, the definitions, and working with multi-stakeholders, right? Working with digital rights organizations, with researchers, because the problem is really complex, the problem is global, and therefore it needs multi-stakeholder participation.
That list is fascinating. Just as an example in my head, I'm a journalist. I'm thinking of 15 follow-up questions, and one is, who gets to control that list, or who gets to decide? So, and I don't know, both of you can talk to this, but the idea of a list of terrorists, potential terrorists or identified people, it's already sensitive enough when the State Department changes its list, and they have all the reasons why they may not want to add even pretty bad actors to that list because of all the legal triggers that start when you do that. So when this is interesting. As a watchdog wants a private company to do more. In this case, asking the private company to release a public list of what they think, who they think are terrorists, or what they think are, or is it more nuanced than that, Dean? Are these groups that are you using guidance from the State Department terrorist watch list, for example, or other types of legal advice to make sure that you're not overstepping bounds or accidentally ruining someone's life or accidentally shutting down, like Irene said, Syrian activists who are trying to post evidence online to for a greater good.
And the list is changing. I'll just add that, right? So for example, Myanmar added the Arakan Army, which is an ethnic armed organization. They designated the Arakan Army as a terrorist organization. And then the Myanmar government designated the Arakan Army as an ethnic armed organization. And then the coup happened. And then the new military government said, oh, we're taking that organization off from the terrorist list. So that means that companies need to adjust to these changing realities as well. Do they adjust, right? Like these are all questions on the list alone.
And it's the same question we're hearing in the military, the Pentagon right now, trying to root out extremism in the ranks or extremist content and define it. And immediately there's a pushback publicly from right-wing media and right-wing supporters going all the way back to include the January 6th, rioters at Capitol Hill being, criticizing any attempt to label them as terrorist or extremists rather than free speech. As extreme as it might sound or as their actions may have been, it's trying to say that's a different thing than terrorism or extremism speech that even the Pentagon should be allowed to do anything about, much less a private company like Facebook. Dina, what's your reaction to that idea of the list? And can you tell us more of what goes into that?
Yeah, I'm very happy to. So just to take a step back, when we started doing this work, when our team was created in 2016, there was an urgent need for us to assess basically what the most imminent credible threats were on our platform. So when we started with the most severe organizations that we were seeing manifest very clearly on our platforms. As that evolved, we started to look at, one, our legal obligations. So we are a US company, and we've said this on many occasions. As a US company, we have to abide by the foreign terrorist organizations list that comes from the State Department. We also have some sanctions obligations. So those of you who work in this field will be very familiar with the Treasury's OFAC list, and we have some obligations there. So that's the singular tranche of legal obligations that we have that I think it's pretty clear it's not something that we are doing by choice, just because we decided to one day. We're doing it because we have a legal obligation there. And I think as a company, we stand behind that. So that's the initial tranche. The second part of this is to say, we do not comply just generally with the removal of all terrorist organizations globally, right? Because there is a clear understanding that different governments will take different approaches to designations and the utilization of the term a terrorist. And so one of the things that we actually did, and I would urge anybody that's interested in this to look this up, we commissioned our partners over at the Brookings Institute, specifically Chris Meslerol and Daniel Byman, to do a very cursory initial assessment of definitions and designations lists that exist out there in the universe. And what they did was they started to assess the different lists that are publicly available by the Five Eyes government. And what they found was really interesting. One of the things that I always draw from it is that when you look comparatively at these government lists, what you're looking at is not a representation of how much real world threat there is coming from these organizations. It's more a representation of an ability of a government or an actor to lobby said government to include or remove entities from that list. And that's why we don't fully rely on government lists when we look across the world. We look at them as an example of severity. We look at why entities were added or removed from that list, but then we do something else. We have our own in-house designation protocol. So when you look at all the tech platforms out there, you'll see that we are one of the very few, we were the first, and we are one of the very few that currently have a publicly available definition of terrorist actor, terrorist organization, hateful actor, and hateful organization. You can find that publicly available on our website. If you do a quick search for dangerous orgs and individuals, Facebook, it'll show up in our community standards. So we have that definition that we pull from. We then have a protocol that says, one, if there are new organizations that are coming up out there, can we get our partners in-house, our experts that I mentioned to you, those 350 people, to nominate these organizations as we see them. Once it's been nominated, we then take a look at the entity itself, and we see if it meets the thresholds for that definition that we publicly make available. And we look at their manifestation on our platform, offline indicators. We look at a myriad of things. And then it goes through what we call an evidentiary process, right? Like, you have to put documentation behind this. We need to make sure that there is a clear line of evidence as to why we want to include this entity on the list. And then once that's completed, it's sent up to leadership to make sure that, you know, everything is fine-tuned, that it's correct, and that there is a robust amount of information there. And that's how an entity is included on our list. So it is an incredibly robust process. And we've brought in people who have been doing that for many years, doing this research work, this assessment work, this designation work. So that's how an entity gets on our list. Irene's point is very well taken. The calls for the transparency around this list to increase have been coming for many years. And I cannot tell you how much I hear you when you say that, Irene. There are a few reasons why we have not yet put this out in the public. The first is, we've seen that when we do on occasion disclose whether or not an entity is designated, immediately that entity will change its name, will change its branding, will change its logo to try and get back on our platform. So that's not to say that that's the reason. I'm saying that's one of the things that we look at is that going to be a way for those entities on that list to try and bypass our systems? The second thing that is really important is to say that when we release this list, there are a lot of very dangerous actors on this list that are in places in the world where we have offices. And we've seen, again, and this has happened in Europe on a few occasions, that our people have been targeted as a result of people being on this list that are not happy that they are on this list. And then finally, and I know this is not something that's always a top of mind for everybody, when we do release these lists, we are opening up to a lot of legal dialogue, and there's a legal conversation that also has to be had there. I try to avoid that legal conversation as much as I can, but it is an aspect of this dialogue. But that is all to say that those are the things that we have to grapple with, but we're not stopping there. We're saying that we're going to continue to try and push for this list to be released. And if not fully, I'm trying to release more information about that designations process, making sure that where I can, I'm sharing the thresholds that we use. What are we looking at from an evidence perspective? Are we looking at timelines? And I will give a huge hat tip to the fact that we have an oversight board that's also very engaged in this topic and have been advocates for this. So I hear you. We are trying to move this forward internally as well. The last thing that I will say on the designations process is something that Irene mentioned. As a result of our designations, there are certain things that will happen to content around these organizations. Number one, for terrorist and hateful organizations, we remove praise, support, and representation of those entities. That's what Irene was highlighting. So you're not allowed to represent yourself, i.e. say, I am a member of ISIS, I am a member of Al-Qaeda, whatnot. You're not allowed to provide any sort of financial support, call to action on behalf of these entities, but also you're not allowed to praise them. Now, we used to leave it at that. We used to say praise, support, and representation and leave it at that. But as a result of the calls for transparency that Irene has been a big part of, we've now released a very detailed breakdown of that praise, support, and representation bucket. And one of the things I'm hoping to do in the next year is to release examples as well, so that not only are we giving you the breakdown itself, but we're also giving you an idea of what this might look like when it manifests.
So Irene, she's telling you, they're trying to do what watchdog groups want, and that they're listening to what you're saying. My thoughts on what I'm hearing is this all sounds good, but this is what a company as big as Facebook is able to do. What about all the other companies that aren't as big, that don't have 350 people, part of the 35,000 person network, and also maybe separate from that too, I'm thinking of the groups. Of course, as we say in our world, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter, right? So it's easy to say perhaps Al-Qaeda, but what do you do about the Taliban, who just now became the leaders of an actual country, whether they're internationally recognized or not? They're the latest of a long string of terrorist organizations, like the PLO, like in Northern Ireland and many other areas that have tried to go from freedom fighting or terrorist organization to legitimate governing body, or have some sort of ability to do that. And I know in London, for example, and in Great Britain, there are laws that are farther out, restrictive laws more than the United States has on what you're allowed to say and do online, even where you're allowed to go as a private citizen. As a journalist, you're supposed to be exempt from these, but in Britain, you're not. There are homeland laws that are different. So, what are your thoughts on what you heard from what she said, and on those smaller points that I'm thinking about other groups besides Facebook and the future of this, little more complicated list of terrorists when we don't have obviously Al Qaeda, obviously Taliban, obviously ISIS as the enemy that the West is fighting?
Thank you, Kevin. I mean, these are great questions, and dare I say it's a $64,000 question, right? I think these are questions that companies are trying to solve, large and small, except the difference is, as you rightly pointed out, smaller companies don't have the kind of resources that Facebook has, right? And even after all of those resources, they still need to do more. I think we all recognize that. So I can imagine what the challenges are like for us organizations that are a lot smaller. And I think this is why experts like the former UN Special Rapporteur David Kay and others have said there is a need to focus on, first of all, using a rights-based approach, so using international human rights norms and principles, as opposed to trying to play this cat and mouse games with different governments, right, with different levels of legitimacy, some might have like overly broad and vague laws that also do not comply with international human rights standards and norms. And so when companies then try to follow or try to abide by those laws, and obviously you're creating more problems, right? And therefore there is a need to use more of a rights-based approach as opposed to a fragmented country by country approach. I think a lot of experts have been calling for that. And as well, the need to focus more on the process, getting clarity on the process, which, as Dina has helpfully outlined, what Facebook has been trying to do, as opposed to, focusing specifically on or only focusing on the types of content, right? I think there needs to be more transparency into the processes in which content gets determined in the first place, and the rationale as to why. And this relates to my point earlier about the need to release granular data so that researchers can also, have an insight into how companies are making these decisions. And I think because of the complexity of this space, again, I'm going to reiterate the need for companies, large and small, to work with civil society, to work with journalists, to work with experts in the field, so that they are not alone in making these decisions and potentially, risking a PR nightmare or at worst, a genocide, right, being perpetrated through the platform.
I mean, are we at a... Sure, go ahead.
I was going to jump in and just jump in a little on the small platform issue you flagged, because I think Irene is making a really good point here. We can be held to account because, rightly so, we should be held to account. We're a large scale company operating across the globe. I think that's a very fair assessment. But one of the things that I used to do before I joined Facebook is look at how you look at the infrastructure of social media as a whole and how it can be abused and manipulated. And when I joined the company, Facebook had been one of the 4 companies that had come together and said, okay, we all have a lot of resources. It was us at Facebook, Twitter, Microsoft, and YouTube. And we'd all come together to start having these conversations about, how are you doing this? How are you addressing this? Are you using AI? What are you doing there? And then we decided, oh, wait, why not formalize this? And so we created something called the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism. And the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism, when it was created in 2017, aimed to do 3 main things: prevent terrorist abuse of the internet, learn from each other, understand what kind of behaviors are manifesting, and then respond collectively. And when it was started, it was for big major companies, and the aim was to level up the baseline best practices of everybody in the industry. So fast forward to now in 2021, where we have pushed GIFCT and it's become its own independent NGO. It now has 17 different members that are a range of members, from us who are large scale companies to very small one person, basically companies like Just Paste It. with the eye to be inclusive in the way that Irene is mentioning. So GiveCT was for industry by industry structure. It now is independent, and it includes civil society members on our independent advisory council. It includes also government partners as well, but it includes a lot of academics as well as other tech companies to all work together to address this holistically. Because I will say, one of the results of me doing my job well is somebody else's job will become very hellish. A smaller platform will see an increase of users jump from my platform to another platform. And if you're interested at all in reading about this, I'm going to pitch one more academic. I promise I will stop giving you all homework. But we have partners that we're looking at how these different platforms are used and mapping this ecosystem. And if you're interested, Ali Fisher and Nico Pruha have written an excellent paper that looks at the three kind of categories of social media and service providers, talking about beacons that provide a stream of information and gather as many eyeballs as possible, content stores, locations where you're uploading content and users can have access to that, and then content aggregators. So that entire ecosystem is something we're also trying to help with. So to Kevin's point and to Irene's point, not only do we have a responsibility to do it in-house, we acknowledge that if we do our job well, it's going to affect that ecosystem, and we have a responsibility to help everybody outside.
I think this is helpful to always hear said out loud, because again, I think the larger public perception of this issue is just still at the elementary level of, should the government do it or should Mark Zuckerberg do it himself? Who should police the content and who should have the power? But what you're describing is a far more intricate network of players and stakeholders, from academics to small, large companies and government and intelligence in the other world. I wanted to make sure we get some other topics in the hour, including a little bit more about states like China, and also Dina, the blend of extremism and conspiracy theories, and the more and to Irene too, the threats that are less easily defined and even more problematic when it comes to free speech. One of the other companies that maybe that extremism, or terrorist groups could flip to would be something like TikTok, something that's based out of a country like China. That's none of the same cautions or concerns of Western governments have, but still have all the same of a company that wants to be successful and doesn't want to be, fomenting terrorism. What are the concerns with specifically to China that either one of you have of the issue of extremism content on these platforms? I mean, you could take it if you want to start.
Sure. I mean, it would have been great to have someone from TikTok on this panel. I think the organizers tried, but unfortunately that wasn't possible. Sure. I mean, I will just say, I think, again, relating it back to my earlier point about the definitional differences, right? I mean, I think China certainly takes a different view as to what makes a terrorist versus liberal democracies, right? And so I think that alone is the starting point of the problem, right? And what happens is you have ethnic minority groups, minority ethnic groups rather, or you have minority religious groups that are then designated as terrorists. And we certainly see that terrorism is one of the justifications that was made, for example, with all the horrible things that the government is doing in the province of Xinjiang, where the Muslim minority live. And I think I would like to highlight that when it comes to how governments treat these minority groups, and certainly China is not the only country that has done this, characterize a minority ethnic or religious group as terrorist. I think the fear is that these populations and where they live almost become a laboratory of different technologically mediated efforts to surveil and control them. for example, using different tools, from having CCTV cameras installed on their front doors, and if they avoid using the front door, then that flags them as a suspicious individual, as a deviant individual. That means that they need that they require further surveillance. To using different combinations, I guess, of surveillance strategies, all under the guise of countering terrorism. So I think this definitional problem is more than just academic, but it has real implications in terms of how governments treat its people around the world. And again, I will stress that China is definitely not unique in this case.
Yeah, and Dina, how do you? I mean, like Irene said, China, calls Hong Kong protesters as terrorists sometimes. And so, how does your in-house shop, for example, react to or treat or adjust those other types of, when a country as big as China is trying to block that kind of speech or have that kind of influence?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the China question is really interesting, but I will also say that it's not just China. We see this happening in many very large countries that may view LGBTQ rights as a terrorist, a potential national security threat, or view political entities that oppose them as a national security threat. In China, one of the interesting things that we look at from the Facebook perspective is, again, we have a framework to define what a terrorist actor is. And if you meet that criteria, and if you meet that rigorous protocol that we've described, that's how we then will add you to the designations list. So there isn't an option for us to just default to a list that the Chinese government, for example, is giving us. So we've built in protections there. But when we're looking at countries like China and others, I will repeat, we're not just looking at terrorism. We're looking at other kinds of operations that are being conducted on our platform. And I think one of the things that we have worked with Irene and other organizations on is transparency around when we see something like that. Not only do we address this in-house, we look at it in-house, we're looking at, are these organizations that really are terrorist actors? If they're not, then are they minorities? And should we be adding additional protections? And if they are minorities, are we seeing inauthentic state actors trying to maliciously attack them on our platform? How do we address that? And how do we be as transparent as possible? So if you get a chance to, one of the things that we do now is we disclose when we see any sort of information operation or influence operation that's happening on our platforms. And that is something that comes to play here with these state actors that are trying to manipulate our platform. So that's one thing. The other thing that I will say is this is also an inclusion, a sort of breadth versus depth part of the conversation, because we talked about TikTok. We've talked about other smaller platforms as well here. When we look at countering terrorism, there's a question here of how open do we want to be in involving all of these other tech companies that might be based in places like China? Is the end goal of removing that worst of the worst, very severe content off global platforms as a whole and small tech platforms in different parts of the world important enough? And what are the kinds of protections we need to put in place when we're trying to apply this globally? So what we've done as the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism is we've said we have a list that is agreed upon by everybody, and it's the UN Consolidated Counterterrorism Sanctions List. That's it. That's where we got to, because different organizations disagree here. But that's a baseline because we're trying to be inclusive. And so if you are trying to upload any content tied to Hong Kong protests and you're trying to upload that to the ICTs hash sharing database, it will not be allowed it, because we've agreed on a taxonomy. We're trying to be inclusive of as many people as possible because we're trying to get this content off. But it's a really important point to have a conversation around. When it comes to terrorism, do we want to include more people in this conversation in order to take down as much of this abusive content as possible? Or do we want to be selective at around who we bring to the table?
Yeah, so Irene, like that's all fine if Facebook is doing that, but what about when Parler starts up, right? And a group that might be, that may not have the same desire to adhere to any of these rules or ethical norms, much less a United Nations dictated or a sanctioned or approved list of behaviors, and want to just do what they want to do. They're a propaganda shop, or they're maybe mimicking a social media platform like a Twitter or a Facebook or the traditional bigger ones that we hope and think will police themselves in a certain way. Is that, is the Parler case the exception that we don't need to worry so much about, or is that the future?
I mean, that's a great question, but I do worry that if we start making exceptions for one, then, we need to make exceptions for others. And then, I mean, we're already in a very messy situation to begin with. And so I think I would go back again to like the need to use international human rights norms and standards, the need to, when you're making these decisions about, whether to take down content or not, and how fast and et cetera, all the nitty gritty details that matter, right? When it comes to this space, the need is for states to be involved. I mean, at the end of the day, companies are operating within a state's jurisdictions. Companies need to abide by the laws of the state in which they operate in, which, as we've already discussed, can create problems for global companies like Facebook. And, I think we need to still ensure that whatever actions we take in the space is legitimate, it's necessary and proportionate. And because human error does happen, right, when you're making these decisions, there needs to be accountability, obviously, and transparency into how these decisions are made. And at the end of the day, there needs to be grievance procedures, right? I mean, as much as say, Facebook tries to be careful in terms of the content that it removes, human error does happen. Things get flagged by the algorithm that it shouldn't. And so when it comes to content or users that are impacted by these issues, there needs to be a remedy mechanism. And I think, these are really complex issues, and companies need to work together with states in terms of tackling them.
I'm reminded of, I've heard, you probably have all heard too, Brad Smith at Microsoft goes around the world making speeches, and he frequently calls for a kind of common set of rules for the road for cyber actors when it comes to cybersecurity.
The Digital Geneva Convention, yeah.
Right. And, I put the question straight to General Nakasone, the head of the National Security Agency and Cyber Command, at a forum in Asia with representatives from China's government on the panel in uniform, saying, what do you think about agreeing to a certain rules of the road for everyone? And his answer was, sure, you first. The idea that, that the head of U.S. Cybercom says that's a wonderful idea, but his instant reaction is, sure, you first. There's just no trust or faith in it. So what I want to ask maybe Irene is, you're at a university. Do you have a sense of the generation coming up of how they feel these issues? Are they excited and knocking on the door of the center? They want to work in this world of making a better internet, finding better ways? Are they leaning more toward the security side, more toward the free speech side? Do they have a sense of what we're talking about here?
Great question, Kevin, and I'll try to end on a positive note. So I think, working at a university, dealing with a lot of people who are a lot younger than me, I think we're dealing with a generation who grew up with the internet, right? Like, I still remember a time when the internet didn't exist, or at the very least, it was a dial-up internet. Whereas I think for a lot of the people who, I come across with at the university, they are digital natives, as they're called, right? And I do think that, having grown up with the internet, I don't think that, anybody would be naive about it. I don't think most people are naive about it. They understand, the students that I come across with, for example, they understand the challenges when it comes to being on the internet, right? All the bullying and harassment and abuse that a lot of people have encountered online, particularly women, particularly young women. And so at the same time, though, I think having grown up with the internet, maybe they're also optimistic about it. And in fact, and this comes up in a lot of the conversations that I have in terms of, okay, like brainstorming ideas, okay, like how do we get to a better internet than it is today, which is, polarizing, and as I said, full of abuse and harassment, targeting certain groups of people, whether it's women or minorities. And I would like to plug a book written by the Citizen Lab director, Ron Diebert, called Reset. And I think this kind of alludes to your question, Kevin, which is, I think there is a need to reset how we think and use the internet. I think how the internet has developed today has, of course, been made possible by states and private companies and technical people and academics and all of that. But I think there is a need to restrain, perhaps, like in terms of how we use the internet. Especially as you know, addiction has also become a problem among young people in terms of the amount of hours they spend online, but also, again, how we use the internet, right? And so I think resetting the internet in terms of using it for good, resetting it in terms of not just kind of downloading everything to the private sector and hoping that they can solve any and all of our problems. But again, bringing it back to how the internet began, right? Which was really a multi-stakeholder arrangement. You had technical people, academics, businesses, and the state. We all need to work together to make the internet better. And I think in general, there is an optimistic sense among the youth. And so I share that optimism as well.
No, that's helpful to hear. And you're right. Some of us existed in a time before the internet. And so we still look at it sometimes as an other, not as just the inherent world we live in. And we've always been a part of. And not having those experiences growing up in it as an adolescent, especially young women, minorities especially, there's just a completely different lens that you go to that with. Let's shift. We all wanted to talk a little bit more about domestic extremism or however you want to call it, other than terrorism threat concerns in our countries and continents and our issues that we're looking at. So Dina, as you've got Europe, Middle East, Africa in your purview, talk to us a little bit about the difference of tracking terrorist organizations and people versus the rise of right-wing speech, of hate speech, and through the election cycles that we've been through. It's happened. We know about it now. What's being done about it, and what are the solutions on the table that we should be looking out for, or that you would like to see happening more?
Thanks for the question, Kevin. I think, again, to end on a good note, similar to what Irene was saying earlier, we do have a lot of opportunities here. And I think especially the tech industry as a whole has access to immense amounts of information about the way that our users interact with our services and the opportunities we have there to help and support. So one of the things that happened over the last 2 years that was really interesting to us was seeing the impact of conspiracy networks and conspiracy theories on these networks of individuals, and trying to really understand that dynamic between when a conspiracy theory goes from being benign to being violent. And we spent a lot of time trying to understand that, because one of the things that's really interesting about conspiracy theories, from my perspective, is that they don't all start off very violent, right? Something has to allow you entry into this dialogue. And usually it's something that is very benign. For example, do you want to protect children from being exploited, which was the case for a lot of people around QAnon, for example. And when we were looking at that, we were noticing that the indicators that we were looking at before, that clear indicator that I talked about around organizational affiliation, command and control, dissemination of propaganda, goes out the window when it comes to conspiracy theories. When it comes to conspiracy theories, you're really looking at a network of people that have a shared set of common agreed upon beliefs to a certain extent, but are willing to evolve those sets of beliefs as other intrusions come to play. So when we were looking at that, we were trying to understand, how do we encourage people who are in this cycle, who are maybe caught up in the middle of this information cycle, to find other resources and find help. So we started to introduce something called the redirect method, which full disclosure, we sort of stole from our Google colleagues who did really well applying this for YouTube and looking at how they could find individuals that were potentially at risk and provide resources for them. So what we do at Facebook is, in the search bar that you have atop your Facebook page, if you enter specific terms, so for example, 1488 is one that we have found is a very specific in-group term. It's a dog whistle term. It's an in-group term where it's the 14 words of white supremacy, and 88, which is the 8th letter of the alphabet, Heil Hitler. So if you're looking at that, and if you're looking for that, what is really dangerous is, on other platforms, you're looking for content. On Facebook, you're looking for a community. And again, when we're talking about that conspiracy theory and conspiracy network world, a community plus that potential for violence is a very dangerous thing. So when you do search for these terms that we've identified, you will then be served what we call a module that will indicate to you that we know that these are terms that might indicate a violation of our terms of service, or that they are putting the community at risk, and will offer you to click here for more help, and we'll redirect you to a NGO partner, not to us, to a separate NGO partner that has an authoritative voice, that has people working in it that understand the struggles of the individuals searching for these terms, and can provide off-ramping services. In the US, we work with Life After Hate, which is an excellent organization that if you haven't been able to look them up, please do. And we've seen really great engagement, so great that we've actually implemented this in other places, including Australia. We're doing this in Asia Pacific. We're doing this in Germany, and we're hoping to expand more. But the important thing I want to emphasize is, Facebook telling you not to become an extremist is like your parent telling you not to take drugs. It's quaint, it's lovely, but we're not the authoritative voice. And so finding these partners is incredibly important. So that's one of the things. The other thing that I will highlight, and I know we don't have very much time here, but I'm looking at moving forward just for us to think on together, is when it comes to extreme right-wing or neo-Nazi and white separatist movements and their interaction with conspiracy theories. I have two academic partners, Marc-Andre Argentino and Amarnath Amarsingham, who did a really excellent assessment of where conspiracy theories are going to go next. And one of the things that we as a tech company are looking at are violent conspiracy theories don't just stay violent and then go benign. What they do is, you'll notice that they are funneling users from that violent conspiracy network to others that are now softer. So we're looking out for the next conspiracy theory that we need to be very aware of. The other thing that we may see is fragmentation of these users, but then moving to other tech platforms. So again, we're very aware of outlinking and where this next threat could come from. So that's just a bit of what I'm looking at this point in time.
And Irene, we're down to like about 4 minutes or so left. What are the solutions you're tracking or wanting to see more of when it comes to this world? Conspiracy theories.
Yeah, I mean, I think just to stress the need for there to be more accountability, transparency. I've already mentioned meaningful transparency, and for there to be independent oversight of platforms, but also working together with researchers, allowing insight by researchers into these platforms and the processes and the things that they're doing, the decisions that they're making when it comes to the space. I think is really important, and I would think that it would be a good thing for the company, because then they have partners who they can work with. Dina has highlighted a number of them, so I do think that these cross-sectoral collaborations need to continue, because this problem is really complex, and therefore it needs multi-stakeholder engagement.
Dina, this off-ramping, how long has this been, how many years has this been happening at Facebook? And you mentioned you've seen success. What kind of metrics can you tell us? I mean, you have a list of terrorists that you've turned into non-terrorists. Is it that simple?
I wish it were that simple. The unfortunate thing is we have a lot that we're grappling with at any point in time. So we're probably not going to be able to say we fixed it any point soon, but we've been doing this since 2019. The expansion to other regional locations has happened over the last year and a half. from a metrics perspective in the US, we saw in the US and in other places a minimum of a doubling of their incoming traffic. But I can't really, beyond that, I can't really share the metrics because it's the partner's website and it's the partner's engagement. And we have our own monitoring and evaluation of what happens to the users once they're done. And it is positive. We're seeing engagement that goes beyond just click through. So we have the click through rate that has doubled to these partners' websites, but then we're seeing that the conversation keeps going and they are able to then engage with them long term, which is really positive. I think another thing that we're seeing is it's not just going to end at serve up a redirect program. What I'm looking at, and this is something that within the 350 team, within the 15-person team in policy, within my vertical, I'm looking at how do we holistically address these violent networks beyond just leave up and take down. So if you are a member of the academic circle, you are very familiar with the critique of whack-a-mole approach that J.M. Berger coined, which is a critique of just taking down content where you can. And one of the things that we're doing is we're going to say, we're not just going to look at content, we're going to look at behavior, and we're going to look at how we can find networks of that abusive behavior and black out those networks and then serve them up something similar to the redirect method that's catered to that abuse type. Because I can't talk to a Salafist jihadist about, how to offer up them if in the same way that I'm going to talk to a neo-Nazi in Scandinavia somewhere. So making these bespoke services available to our users in a way that addresses the way that they are using our platform is the next frontier. Because that's the way that we get an ecosystem approach, right? We're taking down the content where we need to, we're addressing behavior instead of content where we're seeing that as the abuse type, and then we're serving up support. So that's sort of the next frontier in my mind.
Guys, I think we're at the end of our time, and I wish we weren't. These are fascinating conversations. And again, I think the fact that we're talking about online extremism, all the way, like you said, from whether it's neo-Nazis in Scandinavia to, violent extremism in the Middle East, to jihadists, to China, to spying, to espionage, to LGBTQ communities, women, it affects everybody. And I think I've heard from what I can gather from both of you is that there is and needs to remain even more a community-based approach to these solutions that involves government, that involves companies, that involves watchdogs and researchers and academics. To do it all together, it's not a A/B situation. And I'll say again, I the other common thread I keep hearing, I think, is that it relies on a whole lot of trust in these organizations. Maybe trust but verify, but when of who gets to make these decisions, when it's controversial, even when the military tries to root out their own extremists versus companies trying to do it at national, global levels. So thank you for your time and for offering these really frank assessments of what you're doing and about each other and about the community. And I hope to see more of both of you out and about. And thanks again to the Soufan Center for our panel. And I guess stay tuned for the next one.